It's a late August day in the year of 1346. The men of Edward III, formed up across a low ridge, spy the disciplined ranks of Genoese crossbowmen moving purposely towards them. After them, the massed ranks of hot-headed cavalry under the leadership of King Philippe of France's brother, the Duke of Alençon. The English stand poised, if nervous, as the first bolts are loosed, answering with a hail of arrows from their longbowmen. For Edward, he held a strong position, but could not help balk slightly at the sheer numbers of men-at-arms against him. For Philippe, he had finally cornered his presumptuous vassal, his mind set on humbling Edward to the greatest extremity. It had been a long march for both sides, and now both armies resolved to do battle near a place called Crécy. But first, a warm welcome to a returning sponsor, War Thunder. It's a game I actually play and I wholeheartedly recommend it. For any history buff, the immersion of mastering vehicles of modern war in War Thunder is second to none. The vehicles are detailed and modeled down to individual components, and you can pick vehicles spanning over 100 years of development from the 1920s to the present day. There are more than 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships, which you can customize with hundreds of camouflages, historical markings, and 3D decorators such as bushes and equipment, and take part in dynamic combined combat PvP battles. My favorite feature is the vehicle damage model, as there are no gamey hit points but actual dynamic damage to vehicles and crews. The countless combat features make War Thunder the most comprehensive combat game ever made. Play War Thunder now for free on PC, PlayStation, or Xbox, but make sure you use my link below to get a massive bonus pack that unlocks premium vehicles, boosters, discounts, and free premium account time. Available to new players and those that haven't played in 6 months, it comes with the exclusive vehicle decorator, Eagle of Valor. On top of that, to celebrate the holidays and the new year 2024, until the end of January, all players get the 3 exclusive Gaijin snail decals, Grinch, Rudolph, and Elf. Time to decorate those vehicles in style, but these are available for a limited time, so be quick. See you in the crosshairs! By early 1345, nearly half a decade had lapsed since the failure of King Edward's Tournai campaign, in which his army, under Robert of Artois, was decisively defeated at Saint-Omer, and the citizens and garrison of Tournai had outlasted Edward's siege. The focus had shifted to the succession war in Brittany in the intervening years. However, by the middle of the decade, King Edward resolved to attack the French kingdom on 3 fronts. In the northwest, the Earl of Northampton would enter Brittany, while Edward himself would similarly strike into northern France. The Third Army, which we shall focus on for the time being, would earn a golden reputation in the Gascon theatre under the talented command of Henry of Lancaster, then Earl of Darby. For King Edward, his lands in southwestern France were undoubtedly the jewel of his domains. In previous times, of course, the sway of the English monarchs had extended across much of France. Yet with the collapse of the Angevin Empire under the inauspicious reign of John, the French monarchs had mostly cut down major English possessions to these rich lands. Culturally and linguistically, Edward's vassal Gascons had little in common with their king, based in the north, and were happy under the direct suzerainty of Edward rather than Philippe. A remote English monarch certainly trumped an interfering French one, though the French kings, for their part, always eyed Gascony hungrily. For Edward, Gascony was a matter of financial life or death. Pre-war, around 1,000 vessels per year set sail from Gascony, their holds crammed with, among other things, some 80,000 tons of wine. Perhaps more impressively still, Bordeaux's population outshone London's, the income gleaned from duties imposed on the wine flowing from the Gascon capital easily comprising the greatest state income. Rich as it was, though, French incursions into Gascony had eroded its ability to feed itself effectively, and the province was required to import much of its food, chiefly from England. Thus, Edward sought to maintain and even expand on this symbiotic and fruitful arrangement in southwest France, while Philippe naturally sought to destroy it for his own gain. Edward had replaced the uninspiring and ineffective Nicolas Beche as seneschal, sending Ralph Lord Stafford ahead of Darby with a small force to pave the way, while Darby himself was to make his own voyage to Gascony in May. With a length of service of 18 months and free rein to define his own mission, Darby was given sufficient force to make a dent in the region when his Englishmen were combined with Gascon reinforcements. However, having assembled his force by the 22nd of May, Darby was delayed some weeks by contrary winds. Meanwhile, the Gascons had already moved to strike their French foes, and Stafford moved to besiege the French-garrisoned Blaye and Langon. The effect of the small-scale Gascon attacks was to pin down those smaller French garrisons and to force their call for reinforcements. Those fighting Frenchmen not engaged thus were prosecuting sieges of their own. However, August 9th would finally see the Earl of Derby disembark to shake up this stagnant series of sieges into an outright offensive campaign. Wanting to make as big a political impact as possible in the reduced time he had, Darby immediately recalled the men prosecuting the siege of Blaye, and after combining forces with Stafford at Langon, decided to take on the largest French force at Bergerac. So in a quick march, he surprised and fell upon the enemy, driving them from their siege of Montcuq, and in a running battle slaughtered or drove them across the river. The rout was so successful that Darby's army swept into Bergerac by storm. The battle and Bergerac's fall sounded alarm bells for the French leadership, and now the region was firmly under the gaze of Philippe. The Duke of Normandy, Jean, was given overall command of the response. Darby remained in the looted Bergerac for around a fortnight before marching on Périgueux itself. However, though its defences were poor, the large garrison made a direct assault inadvisable, and Darby instead took surrounding settlements and blockaded it, only to be driven away by a large detachment of Jean's army under Louis of Poitiers. The French may have felt assured at Darby's withdrawal in early October and set about the reconquest of the surrounding settlements. To this end, Auberoche was put to siege, not before word was sent west to Darby at Saint-Emilion. Again, doing the unexpected, Darby and his small force once more rapidly advanced, this time catching the besieging French army at dinner on October 21st. A ferocious melee broke out, and with the decisive attack of the castle's garrison to the rear, the army of Louis was broken, suffering heavy losses. The Battle of Auberoche crowned a brilliant campaign for Henry of Lancaster. The nominal commander-in-chief of local forces, Jean, Duke of Normandy, had no stomach for the fight, and upon learning of the defeat marched his army back to Angoulême, disbanding it and heading north to Châtillon-sur-Indre. With his stunning campaign, Darby was effectively unchallenged in the region until March of the following year. Jean resumed hostilities with an army of around 20,000 and moved to besiege Aiguillon on April 1st. Unable to directly contest such a superior force, Henry of Lancaster, now Earl of Lancaster after the death of his father, called on aid from Edward. Edward was indeed both morally and contractually constrained to oblige, though the manner in which he provided that aid was sufficiently ambiguous. Edward's army assembled around Portsmouth in the May and June of 1346, though exactly where it would strike was unknown to Philippe. Edward himself came to Portchester Castle on June the 1st to oversee further preparations, so that by the time of departure, the king had anywhere between 10 and 15,000 men under his command. Philippe was not the only man in the dark, as even many of Edward's leading men were unsure of their destination. At a council session on the 20th of June, the assumed journey to Gascony was scrapped, with the king either revealing his true intentions or amending his original plan. The real landing point would be the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Philippe did attempt to cover all his bases, expecting an invasion in either Brittany or Gascony. Charles of Blois was active in the former, but had been defeated by a smaller Anglo-Breton force under Sir Thomas Dagworth. The Duke of Normandy remained fixed in place at Aiguillon. Aware of the threat to the north, Philippe ordered reinforcements to be drawn from Jean's army under the Constable of France. Edward himself finally set sail from Portsmouth on the 11th of July, arriving at the Cotentin before sunrise on the 12th. With his army fully disembarked by the 18th, an orbit of destruction of around 35 kilometers drove many refuges into the woods or to the south. Though Edward declared that no life or property be taken, this declaration was not taken very seriously. The invaders cut a swathe through the Norman land, while 200 of the original fleet of ships traced the coastline, seizing or destroying enemy ships. By the 24th, the city of Caen was firmly within sight of the invaders. Caen was the largest Norman city west of Rouen, based on the Aisne, which was itself a decent barrier to incursion. The Constable Raoul II gathered all available men and concentrated there, determined to delay Edward long enough for a larger French force to muster under Philippe. The city was divided into an old and new town, the former surrounded by decaying walls that even with repairs stood little chance of effectively holding back the invaders. An indomitable castle was present in the north. However, the new town was actually ostensibly more defensible as it was surrounded by water. The defending force of around 4,000, as well as the citizens of Caen, bunched into this area. On the morning of the 26th of July, the English army quickly overrun the two walled abbeys which were not defended, and quickly overrun Old Town on discovering that the constable and his men had concentrated to the south. The castle was still held by the French, and a number of ships blocked the passage between the Audin, the entrance to the island also heavily defended within the Porte Saint-Pierre. Unfortunately, the river surrounding the defenders was low due to summer weather, and though the defenders at the bridges initially checked the rash charge of many of Edward's men, many other Welsh spearmen and longbowmen waded across to assault the defences elsewhere. Though harassed by crossbow fire, the latter assault broke through the line of ships, firing two and causing the others to withdraw. Smashing through the thin defenders, they then attacked the defenders at the bridge from behind. 2,500 citizens of Caen were then butchered, while some defenders managed to beat their way towards the refuge of the castle, while others, including Raoul, took refuge in the towers only to be captured later on. Remaining at Caen for 5 days while his army devastated the surrounding country, Edward then steadily moved towards Paris, halting at Lisieux. Meanwhile, Philippe was still amassing an army at Saint-Denis. Edward spent 2 days in fruitless peace negotiations with some papal emissaries before pressing on towards Rouen. Finding Normandy's capital occupied by a substantial, if disorganized force, and the nearby bridge broken, the English army snaked its way along the Seine, shadowed all the way by Philippe. By the 12th of August, Edward was dangerously close to Paris itself, the citizens of which were in a state of near hysteria. Philippe moved to the capital itself while Edward partially crossed the Seine at Poissy, having rebuilt the broken bridge. Unwilling to indicate his true direction of march, Edward used a formal challenge to battle given by Philippe to deceive the French monarch. Having specified a location south of the river, Edward sent a raiding party south in the direction of Chartres, and is generally believed to have fooled Philippe into believing his acceptance of this. Philippe amassed his army near the southern wall by the Abbey of Saint-Germain, and then marched some 4 miles south to await his enemies. Instead, Edward made a proverbial run for it. Perhaps feeling a little foolish, Philippe hotly pursued, covering an impressive 25 miles per day. Meanwhile, the English army moved slower, the abandonment of some wagons to increase speed not as effective as hoped, and the pillaging and breakaway engagements slowing the advance further. In addition, the French had deprived the English of much sustenance and so necessitated wide-ranging foraging parties for the army to feed itself. The result was that the leading elements of Philippe's army reached the Somme first. While Edward's army was at Rennes, Philippe's main body was encamped at Amiens by nightfall of the day and boasted larger numbers. With Philippe having had either all the bridges destroyed or garrisoned, Edward and his tired army had few courses open to them. Rejecting either fighting where he was or taking ship at Saint-Valery, Edward pressed towards the crossing at Blanchetaque. As with the other crossings, Blanchetaque too was heavily defended. Having arrived there before dawn, Edward's men found the tide was still up, and so a long, tense wait progressed as the enemy commander, Godemar du Fay, neatly lined his 3,500 men on the far bank to oppose their foes. At the forefront were 500 men-at-arms, and shooting mercilessly at the advancing English vanguard of 100 longbowmen and as many men-at-arms were crossbowmen. However, though taking some losses, the longbowmen returned fire in kind while the men-at-arms charged ahead to hold a beachhead. As Englishmen continued to pour in from behind, Godemar had no choice but to give ground, falter, and then flee towards Abbeville, pursued all the way to the gates. Philippe was not in Abbeville to greet them, as he had moved south in hopes of pinning Edward's army between the river and the coast. While his vanguard under John of Bohemia did manage to seize some wagons, it was too little too late, as Edward's rear guard completed the crossing, taking all of an hour to accomplish this. With the tide rising once again, Philippe was prevented from immediately pursuing. While Edward's destructive march through the Norman countryside had progressed, a separate force under Sir Hugh Hastings had been active further east. However, on the same day Edward crossed the ford, this army, comprised mostly of Flemish allies, dispersed. With no hope of linking up with Hastings or outrunning Philippe, Edward's army headed for high ground adjacent to the village of Crécy. Though facing a larger host, Edward had chosen his ground well. His army was positioned on a gentle ridge between the villages of Crecy and Ouadicourt. Crécy itself hugged the Maye River, with the forest south of that. Edward's rear was partially covered by wooded terrain, and nearby he had ordered a fortified camp built, which enabled swift retreat of wounded and storage of thousands of the arrows utilized by his crucial longbowmen. Philip's scouts reported that Edward's army was deployed across the ridge. The entire force was dismounted. To the right were the men-at-arms and longbowmen under the nominal command of the 16-year-old Edward of Woodstock, later immortalized as the Black Prince. Though small in number, it was likely here too that some field guns were placed. To the left stood the mixed men-at-arms and longbowmen of the Earls of Northampton and Arundel, while King Edward himself held his own contingent in reserve, the king stationed near a raised windmill that gave a good view of the battlefield. In all, Edward's army likely numbered upwards of 15,000 men, though the exact numbers are debatable. The French army had many more men-at-arms, some 12,000 who were mounted. In addition, 6,000 Genoese crossbowmen were also located close enough to play a role in the action. Finally, the chroniclers inform us of an innumerable number of infantry, most of which were following on the road from Abbeville, along with the baggage. Initially, Philippe had been advised to not engage the battle-ready English, but to march north of them to rest at La Broye. His mounted units and the Genoese crossbowmen were indeed at hand, but tired from the hours-long march. Without his army fully concentrated, he would also be attacking under strength. At first, Philippe agreed that hostilities should be postponed. However, perhaps he also felt that another stalemate in the vein of Bouvines in 1340 was unacceptable, both as a stain on his own honour and practically too, given it was already difficult to keep his over-eager men-at-arms on a leash. These proud Frenchmen were eager to deal death and punishment to Edward's invaders. Philippe's younger brother, the Count of Alençon, insisted he would attack as soon as he was able. Since matters were already out of his hands, Philippe decided to initiate hostilities with his more disciplined division of Genoese crossbowmen. Philippe ordered these to form the first of 3 broad groups for the attack. Behind these were formed the mounted men-at-arms of the hot-headed Count of Alençon, along with the cream of the nobility. Finally, Philippe himself directly commanded the 3rd group with the rest of the mounted men-at-arms. Though we can speak of this organization in a broad sense, in reality the attack had no defined plan, but was essentially the collective rage of the amassed French warrior elite, hell-bent on making their English tormentors pay a bloody price for their deprivations. In contrast, Edward's men awoke and took their places that morning at an almost lazy pace. Their position was already strong, but Edward had also ordered thousands of small potholes to be dug to impede the charge of Philippe's cavalry. These dotted the approach to the English lines. Before any such show of chivalric bravado, however, the Genoese crossbowmen were ordered forward to soften up the English ranks. This proved to be unwise, given the shields that usually guarded the mercenaries as they reloaded were still coming up with the baggage. Fate further frowned upon the ill-starred attackers as a sudden storm broke out as they advanced. This had the effect of both muddying the ground as well as soaking the strings of the attackers, rendering their shots less powerful. In contrast, the longbowmen found it much easier to unstring their bows and keep them dry under their helms. Once the weather brightened and the enemy were within sufficient range, Edward's longbowmen loosed a series of volleys that shredded the unprotected Genoese. Though ineffectually responding in kind, the Genoese faced grave odds in this projectile duel, their weapons' effective range already blunted and shooting with the sun in their faces. Unsurprisingly, they fragmented and ran. What they probably did not expect was death to be dealt from their very own allies. Moving from behind was the massed ranks of the French cavalry, under the abrasive Count of Alençon. Angered at their flight, while eager to bleed their English counterparts beyond, Alençon yelled, "Ride down this rabble who block our advance!" This chapter of the battle was just as chaotic as the subsequent attacks, Alençon's units cutting through or hampered by the retreating Genoese. This, of course, dulled the power of the French charge itself, along with the churned-up ground of the aforementioned potholes. Worst of all, the devastating arrows of the despised longbowmen obliterated this first charge before it even reached the men-at-arms. Indeed, with several thousand longbowmen and a rate of around 1 shot per 5 seconds, the sky must have blackened with these volleys, the horses of Alençon's men-at-arms hopelessly vulnerable, throwing their riders as they fell or broke their legs via the potholes. Only a few of the 4,000 or so cavalry group made it through to their intended victims and were easily dispatched. King Philippe had ominously raised the Oriflamme banner to signal no quarter to his enemy. Similarly, Edward declared no captives would be taken, a sound decision given the brutal math of the situation. Even if he had desired to do so, he could not spare the men to guard such prisoners. Now the once brazen survivors of the arrow storm were unceremoniously ripped from their horses, many English and Welshmen perhaps taking grim pleasure in dispatching their French betters with a stab through the visor or in an opening at the joint. Among the dead was King Philippe's reckless brother, Alençon. Yet the destruction of this first wave of French cavalry only seems to have encouraged further charges. Philippe must have painfully realized the extent of the disaster and his own impotence to stop it. The momentum of battle was simply too irresistible. As more units entered the field, it fed into the general advance towards the English. One particularly famous, if sad, attempt to break the English ranks was made by the blind King of Bohemia. Aged but eager to strike at least one blow, he had 2 of his knights tie their horses' bridles to his, and charging fearlessly at the head of his 2,000 Czech men-at-arms, this charge largely mirrored the fate of Alençon's, though some men did smash through the Black Prince's lines, emerging in his rear. The young Edward was now pressed hard. Geoffrey Le Bécaire writing, "The young prince displayed marvelous courage, running through horses, felling knights, crushing helmets under his blows, and all the while he encouraged his men, pulling fallen friends to their feet and setting everyone an example." Despite this evident skill and courage, however, a knight tore through the press of enemies to request aid from King Edward himself. Yet, after being assured his son was neither wounded or dead, the king famously replied, "Let the boy win his spurs, for I wish the day to be his, if God wills it, and that he and his companions should have the glory of it." The attack on the prince was so fierce as to see his banner fall. Either the fighting was so fierce that Edward's banner bearer dropped it to assist his stunned master, or it was ripped away by the Count of Hainaut. Either way, it was soon recovered by Sir Thomas Daniel, to the likely relief of both the king and the prince's men nearby. Apparently worried enough after all to send some knights to reinforce his son, they found the situation had stabilized, with the prince having regained his feet and fighting on. With each charge, more and more dead or dying horses and men piled up to impede the next. At some stage, perhaps unable to stand the sight of his dying army anymore, King Philippe himself led his own force into the fray. Philippe fought bravely, the French monarch having 2 horses slain from under him, and was also wounded by an arrow to his throat or face. Despite his courage, however, it was apparent to all that this latest assault was doomed to failure too. As darkness crept in, John of Hainaut, along with the king's retainers, escorted the reluctant Philippe from the field. What remained of the French in arms below Edward's position was possibly charged by remounted men-at-arms, though given the aforementioned state of the ground, this seems unlikely. As the night endured, Edward was likely assured he had the victory. The next morning, the true extent of the French casualties were realized. Both Edwards surveyed the dead, and on seeing the body of the brave blind king of Bohemia, the Black Prince was so moved as to adopt John's ostrich feather badge as his own, this in tribute to his courage. The Princes of Wales use the badge to this day. With the threat of the French army removed, Edward could now move north at his leisure. The Crécy campaign had undoubtedly been a blinding success, but now Edward resolved to secure a permanent foothold in the north and headed first to Boulogne, before finally setting sights on heavily fortified Calais. Crécy was won, but a much longer battle was about to begin. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to play it for free on PC, PlayStation or Xbox now by using my link in the pinned comment or video description. If you're a new player or haven't played in 6 months, you will also receive a massive bonus pack across all platforms, including multiple premium vehicles and other goodies. And until the end of January, all players will also get 3 exclusive and festive Gaijin snail decals on top of it. These are available for a limited time only, so make sure not to miss out. If you enjoyed watching, attack the like button and subscribe, and leave a comment as a sacrifice to the algorithm. Support us on Patreon and get early access to our videos for as little as $1, or click the thanks button below to leave a one-time tip. As always, we'll see you in the next one.